Let's roll.
Hello and welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show. Here you get relevant and timely content you won't find anywhere else. You can learn more by going to mustreadalaska.com, and this show can be found on YouTube, Facebook, X, and your favorite podcast site. Let's talk truth about politics, the economy, and all things Alaska. Now, the host of the show, former state legislator, combat veteran, small business owner, and all-around great guy, Ben Carpenter.
Well, welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show, friends. I'm Ben Carpenter, your host and guide, as we brave a journey of discovery towards truth and independent-minded thinking. Must Read Alaska exists because describing the truth is hard. It calls upon us to be relentless in defense of common sense, our faith in God, and the exceptional values enshrined in our Constitution. Freedom is not free. It is not for the timid. It was not secured by the weak of heart or mind. And maintaining freedom requires every one of us to be alert to daily encroachments on our liberties and on the grand deceptions of those seeking power and control over others. Every generation must pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and we must never take our freedom for granted. We are not anti-government, we are pro-government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And today we've got two guests with us from the Reason Foundation. Mr. Ryan Frost and Miss Mariana Trujillo have joined us from down in the lower 48. Good evening, or good afternoon, I guess it is, here in Alaska. Why don't we go ahead and get some introductions out of the way? We'll start with you, Ryan, if you'll introduce yourself and kind of tell us what the Reason Foundation is.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Ryan Frost. I am one of the managing directors of the Pension Integrity Project at Reason Foundation. Reason Foundation is a small L libertarian think tank. We do a lot of policy research across the country and almost every state. We've been up in Alaska for the last few sessions talking about the pension bill, which is what we'll be talking about today. Thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
And Mr. Trujillo, can you give us a quick bio of yourself?
Yeah, well, I work in the pensions team. I research pension systems, and now recently doing a lot of work in the topic of recruitment and retention of public employees across the country, and research pension debt, but also all kinds of government debt, and as you said, how to make government better and more efficient. And Brian has been doing a lot of work in Alaska, and I got looped into investigate some of the claims and the discourse around recent developments, and I've been really surprised by what I found.
Well, thank you for joining us today, both of you. The Alaska State Legislature has a bill before it this legislature, as it did last legislature. We had Senate Bill 88 last time, and now it's Senate Bill 78 this year, this time, that's proposes to take us back to a defined benefits retirement system that we currently have, but is closed to new employees. New employees in the state of Alaska go to come into a defined contribution system. So I guess maybe just to start off here to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. What is a defined benefit system, and how is it compared to a defined contribution system?
Sure. So defined contribution system it's very similar to what everybody in the private sector has at this point, similar to a 401k where the employee puts money in, the employer puts some money in, and then that money's invested in the stock market. It accumulates over a member's career. And then the member at retirement can choose to do a few things with that pot of money. They can take it all out. They can draw from it slowly. They can annuitize it. A lot of options. Defined benefit system is, basically what it sounds like. It's a defined benefit. It's based on how many years you work, what your highest salary is, and then there's a what's called a multiplier aspect to that to come up with essentially what you'll get in retirement every year. The main difference between the two is really the who holds the risk. Under a defined benefit system, all the risk is on the employers and the state. In a defined contribution system, all the investment risk would be on the employee. And so that's really the two main differences. Functionally, at retirement, they work very similarly. Um, there's one downside to defined benefit plans is they're not portable. You can't take it with you if you go somewhere else. Defined contribution plan, it follows you everywhere you go. So for a more mobile workforce, obviously a defined contribution would be better for somebody generally that works a full career in just one job, which is what we've seen is less than 5% of employees at this point. Defined benefit might be better. So that's really the main differences is one's promise a certain amount of money at retirement. The other one is promises you a certain amount of dollars going into your retirement savings every month.
Very good. Thank you. So defined benefits retirement systems used to be more popular. They used to be like corporations used to have them, and more entities used to have them. Why have they moved away? Why have they become less popular over time?
Yeah, but yeah, private sector, I'm not aware of many, if any, that still had defined benefit systems. A few have what's called cash balance systems still, which is kind of a hybrid between the two. But corporations moved away, frankly, because they couldn't afford it anymore. The math behind what they had put in to save for these pensions end up being inaccurate, and we're seeing that across the public plans as well. There's over $1.5 trillion just in public pension debt, and that's just because the calculations of how much was supposed to be saved and invested and what the returns on that would be was just really inaccurate. And so these corporations, they're not governments. They have to make money, and a lot of these pension plans end up putting them billions of dollars in the hole. And so they frankly they had no choice but to get rid of them.
And many of those corporations, um, they didn't just get rid of them by offering just by, transitioning new employees to a defined contribution plan. Many actually went bankrupt because of their retirement plans. And then in bankruptcy, they negotiated with their employees and basically defaulted on a good chunk of their benefits. The problem with defined benefits, as Ryan said, is that it is really hard for you to estimate how much this future stream of income is going to cost today. And it is more common than not that administrators end up putting less money than they should today to pay for future benefits. And that gap in funding compounds over time with interest, given how benefits are calculated. So you often end up paying a lot more in the future with defined benefits, not only because the risk is all with you, but because it is very common to underfund your plan. And then you have to catch up in contributions, making a good chunk of that through interest. So you have underfunding that compounds with other underfunding, and so it's really expensive. It's risky, and unfortunately, the private sector, how a lot of companies got rid of it was by defaulting on many benefits, and telling employees, I'm going to pay 60% of what I promised you, but governments can't do that. So many governments have been just dealing with this and, amortizing their debt and finding ways to pay it and sacrificing, services and, raising taxes for current taxpayers to pay for, previous benefits. And of course, it's really unfortunate that many workers got their retirement security stripped away from them from DB bankruptcies in the private sector. It's unfortunate that this is, the history behind defined benefits and what we try to work with as we move forward and keeping all that in mind,
If we bring that thread of conversation home to Alaska, what is the status of our defined benefit system? Underfunded, overfunded? Where are we at in the state of Alaska?
Yeah, as of the latest figures, the plans that again they closed 20 years ago, as of this year, are still over 7 billion in debt, and that's despite the state putting in billions, hundreds of millions of dollars in extra contributions every year. That debt has still continued to climb, and it hasn't really reached its peak where we're seeing it start to come down. It's still actually increasing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We can get into them. But yeah, as of today, it's over, I think, 7.6 billion combined between the public employees and the teachers' plans.
That's unfortunate for us, I guess. The state of Alaska Constitution, Article 7, Section 7, says that membership in employee retirement systems of the state or its political subdivision shall constitute a contractual relationship. Accrued benefits of these systems shall not be diminished or impaired. So if I understand that correctly, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't think you guys are attorneys either, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I read there is that there's not a way for the state, nor would we want the state to, but there's not a way to default on this. The state has an obligation for that $7 billion, and it will be paid one way or the other.
Yeah, it's pretty settled legal precedent that earned and accrued benefits, even if you were to hire somebody for one day, the pension they were promised, you can't change it. And so yeah, that 7.6 billion has to be paid no matter what. It falls under numerous probably state constitutional law and also falls under the contracts clause of the United States. So yeah, those are public sector pensions. Once those are locked in, there's no choice but to get them paid off.
I've thought through this while I was in the legislature. I thought through this numerous times, and I know that this is probably outside the scope of what the Reason Foundation has looked at, but we've got an $80 billion permanent fund in the state that normally, under current law, the legislature can't spend from the corpus. But I would imagine that if we ever reached a situation with our finances where the courts and the government had to come to some sort of an agreement or an arrangement on comparing which part of the Constitution is going to trump, right? You can't get into the corpus of the fund constitutionally, but you also can't diminish your retirement account. So which of those is going to hold true? And I would just guess that the courts and the government are going to have to use any funds available, and that's either through taxation or spending of any of the money that is managed by the state to make those retirement systems whole. And I wouldn't put it past a future generation of legislature to do exactly that with a portion of the corpus of the permanent fund to make that whole.
Yeah. I mean, to give the state credit, they've put billions, they've put a couple billion surplus in the mid 2010s, plus all the extra few hundred million every year to try and get this paid down so that doesn't become a possibility. But it's just proven to, unfortunately, not be enough.
Mariana, one of the arguments being presented with HB 78 and the return to a defined benefit system is that it will improve recruiting and retention within the public sector, within the state, and not just state employees, but also subordinate law enforcement and teachers and those that would be covered within the new retirement system. Is there evidence that that's an accurate assumption?
So there are a few elements to that question, right? The first thing is, assuming that, and a lot of these, proponents of the defined benefit plan are, coming out and arguing that, Alaska is, facing a unique retirement and retention crisis, that the state is having trouble recruiting people, and that we need, and the only thing that can solve this is a defined benefit plan. So on the first part of the question is Alaska facing trouble with, recruiting and retaining its public employees? Well, I've looked at some numbers that point me to that not being the case in any way. We have data on public sector turnover for the state of Alaska, and actually we find that Alaska has remained below the U.S. average for consistently, and which is actually quite surprising because Alaska is a state, if you combine its private and public sector turnover, if you look at just the general labor force turnover, how are people switching jobs, how often they're switching jobs in Alaska, Alaska consistently leads national rankings. Alaska is the state with the highest overall private and public sector combined, just statewide turnover, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the fact that the public sector turnover in Alaska is below average is quite extraordinary. Again, considering it's a state that has, is facing net migration. It's a state that just faces high turnover in many ways because of, challenges that are particular to Alaska and the labor market in Alaska. To see that not coming across public sector turnover is actually extraordinary. I expected to see, a turnover rate that was higher than average, but that's still being, reasonable considering, the context of Alaska. But we don't see that. In 2022, the national average turnover for state and local employees was 21%. And Alaska's public sector turnover was of 17.5. And also, if you just look in general in context of other states, we have also found that Alaska's turnover is very much in line with other states that still offer defined benefit plans of a variety of generosities, and even with states that offer defined contribution plans or hybrid plans. Alaska's turnover rate is very much in line. Well, Alaska's public employee turnover rate is very much in line with other states, and is surprisingly low given its private sector turnover. So the first element of the question is not clear. Alaska is facing, more difficulties recruiting and retaining employees in its public sector, and that hasn't really changed over time. So we don't really see a change in that, given the change in retirement benefit. And then the other element of the question is then, even if Alaska were having trouble recruiting employees, or would like to improve its, recruiting and retaining and retention capabilities, would offering a defined benefit pension plan or any kind of pension enhancement work? So we just see that generally in the data that employees are much less responsive to pension benefits than to salary benefits. Some estimates even put that to be about half. But every dollar that you put in your pension has half the impact of dollars you put in towards salary. That's a recent Congress, CBO's estimates. And just also specifically looking at this proposal defined benefit plan, and Ryan has an interesting chart that I think we could share now. We have estimated that actually for most employees, they would get a worse benefit under a defined benefit plan. So that is quite puzzling, right? That if you want to make a reform that is going to cost more money, but it's aimed at increasing the, recruitment and retention capabilities. You want to leave your employees better off, right? Give them a better deal. The fact that you're proposing a reform to fulfill that goal that will leave most employees with the worst retirement, that doesn't really, help the case, right, at all. So Ryan, do you want to give an overview of what we're seeing?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, step us through this, Ryan, and show us what we're looking at.
Sure. So this is benefit modeling. So this is specifically focused on Alaska's teachers. We can go through different groups here, but what this chart's showing is two different bars here. So columns. This first column in orange is the annual annuity that a teacher could expect to earn based on how many years they work as a teacher in Alaska. And again, the orange line would be if they stay in the DC. The blue line would be if the House Bill 78 were to pass, which would put all teachers in a defined benefit system. What would their annuity, their annual pension check look like? Their annual pension amount look like, excuse me. And what we see consistently is that no matter how long a teacher works in Alaska, they would be worse off under House Bill 78. And that's despite, as we can get into in a little bit, the House Bill 78 in the best case scenario costing probably around $2 billion extra over the next 30 years. So for $2 billion extra, essentially we're giving a worse benefit to every teacher, when from our perspective, if there is a benefit gap that Alaska is trying to solve, and Ben, you would know this better than anyone since you ran a bill about it last session. The largest gap is that teachers and many other employees in Alaska don't have Social Security. However, you do have a really amazing Social Security replacement plan that's called SBS, and it puts essentially the same rates that would have went into Social Security instead into SBS. But the amount that you earn in SBS is far greater than anything that you would ever return on Social Security. So when we look at a chart like this, we would say, okay, most teachers do not work full careers anymore, and that's across the country. That's not just Alaska. The average teacher turnover, I think, half of all teachers across the country in defined benefit plans, we're not even talking about defined contribution plans. In defined benefit plans, half of every teacher is gone before they even hit 5 years. Another 40% are gone before they reach full service. So for 90% of employees, we're giving worse benefits to them that cost more because you're trying to solve an issue that they don't have Social Security. Well, the solution to that is not to bring a defined benefit back. It's to offer them this SBS, which is this button here, and that overlays in green. This green amount here is SBS annuity, is what Alaska teachers are not earning right now that they could be earning if they were in that. And if you go over a 30-year career, this is an extra $68,000 a year that teachers are missing out on. And to us, that's really the story. If you're going to talk about a pension need in Alaska, it's getting everybody in this really probably the best Social Security replacement plan in the country, SBS. And it's not putting them in something that's going to be worse off for the vast majority of employees.
Here's just a hypothetical question here, and what's the value here? And maybe I'm asking a political question that's this is the wrong conversation I have it in, but what's the value for returning to a defined benefits plan? Is it control? Is it locking people into a position, and that's what it's about?
I think for the state, there is some of that. You hear that in public testimony from some of the employer groups and from some of the legislators that they don't like that people can leave with their DC account and not have to, they can leave with their money and go do something else. A lot of the public safety groups don't like that, their cops get poached by the lower 48. They feel that that's happening because they don't offer a defined benefit. For the employee, it simply comes down to, we can show this chart, and we do show this chart to almost every plan we work with because it looks very similar to this. But the blue bar is guaranteed no risk to the employee that this will ever change. The orange line, if can change because there's market risk. Whereas if there's market risk in the DC, the employee's benefit goes down. If there's market risk in the DB, all the state and the employers pay billions of dollars in extra costs. So for the employee, it simply just comes down to, I think, a risk averseness more than anything. For the state employers, it comes down to, not liking that members have the option to frankly leave whenever they want.
One of the things
I think too is,
oh, go ahead,
if
Mariana.
I could just jump real quick too, I often find this as, a matter of branding and almost cognitive bias. Like we really, defined benefit just sounds, the name, right? It just sounds like it's something that must be more generous. It must be better for employees. And we see that attitude sometimes even in other researchers where they're, researchers that look into this from an academic perspective are always often surprised to one, and the answer is that defined contribution plans could be better for employees than defined benefit plans if designed right. But I think a big part of it might even be coming from members that are just skeptical of the idea of a defined contribution plan that, as Ryan said, places some risk on them, would ever be better and would ever lead to a better benefit than something that has the word defined in the name. Defined benefit. Sorry, I had the word, I think it's just often a matter of many people, refusing to engage with, the facts and finding that anyone that is trying to propose something else must be just, finding ways to justify their ideas and not, being open to the idea that a defined contribution plan could lead to a better and more generous benefit and lower costs for everyone is, just can't believe it.
Yeah, there is one group where that is where they do understand. That's higher ed teachers. They have been in defined contribution plans for decades, and they love their defined contribution plans because they're really generous, and they can move with them if they want to switch around.
Well, that's an interesting comparison there. That the higher education, I'm going to have to do some investigation of that. I've never really considered that, Ryan, on what's happening with the higher ed pieces. I would have assumed that they would have preferred the government approach, the defined benefit approach, but I guess that light bulb's just clicking on in my head for some reason after all these years of
Yeah.
talking through this. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you guys were talking was consequences of decisions, and we're not just with respect to retirement, but life and how much can I stretch my dollar from my paycheck, right? The decisions that we make at the ballot box do impact that. I mean, we have been going through a period of pretty high inflation in some sectors of the economy, and those in Alaska who have been buying food and feeding themselves for the last couple of years are certainly aware of the inflation that has happened, just within everyday commodities. And so, if you've got an employee that works for a government that has a guaranteed defined benefit retirement and doesn't really care what happens in the economy because it's kind of disconnected from my future, right? I've got my state employment check and I've got my state retirement check guaranteed in the future. So whatever happens financially in the private sector and the results of policy decisions both at the state and federal level, I'm kind of insulated from them. It doesn't really matter to me. Whereas those that are in the private sector, they have a direct, they're directly tied to that inflation. When inflation gets too high or the economy takes a dump, then private sector employers get rid of private sector employees. But we don't see that happen in the state government. I mean, the state of Alaska has not been reducing employment over the last decade when we've been struggling with budgets and struggling with revenue. That is not the case. We went the opposite direction. We added more employees and more positions. So I
Yeah.
guess I just see this as a way to control people, and through the system that you have them, the natural byproduct of that is there's not really a concern about what happens with government because I'm insulated from it.
Well, yeah, and one other aspect to that is almost every defined benefit pension has inflation protection in retirement through a cost of living adjustment. So, there's even less, you know, worry about that in retirement, which, that's frankly, if we would build one, we would want to have inflation protection. There's ways to do it in DC through annuitization as well. Um, so yeah.
Well, what are some of the costs associated with the pension systems? Can you help us understand what the costs would be?
Sure. Do you want to just talk about the bills costs or kind of where Alaska is now and
Well,
what the bills could do to it?
I think we've got time to touch on both. Why don't we
Okay.
start with what Alaska's costs are and then look at the bill?
Sure. So did this screen pull up okay?
Yep,
The
we're looking
change?
at it.
Yeah.
Great. So this is so all this data comes from our annual pension report. It's something we put out once a year, looks at about 296 plans across the country. So up here, I'm just looking at all the pension plans in Alaska. So we call this our mountain of debt chart, and this is where we get that $7.6 billion figure from. So that's how much debt as of 2023 the state held in unfunded accrued pension liabilities. Now, if we go down here, it kind of tells a bit of a story about where that gap started happening. It's a very common story, 08, 09, large losses in the markets. And as the assets have grown, the gap between assets and liabilities has not closed in Alaska as quickly as it has in some other states. And here's, this as a portion of the debt, the state essentially holds, all the debt in Alaska. So they're on the hook to pay it all off. If, when we talk about pension debt, though, it's really key that we talk about assumptions as well. And will the plan earn what it expects to earn? History tells us probably not. And Alaska still, as of today, has one of the 5 highest, or you could say rosiest assumptions in the country about what they expect to earn on their investments. And that's really surprising since the plan's been closed for 20 years. And so the asset pool has been diminishing over that time. You would expect to see at least some amount of lower risk tolerance going forward in the portfolio, but we have not seen that in Alaska. And so when we look across the country, we see, all the capital market assumptions, all these pension plans expect to earn. We're seeing right around 6 to 6.5 over the next 30 years. And right now, Alaska expects to earn 7.25. And
And
so
that's what we would find in the HB 78.
that's right. And that's frankly, one of my biggest problems with the bill is that instead of having a new tier be set on a more realistic looking forward basis, it's using the assumptions from a plan that's been closed for 20 years. And we just, that's just not really based in reality, frankly.
So
And
one
so,
of the articles that I saw that is published there on reasonfoundation.org discussed the bad assumptions on the discount rate. Can you explain that?
sure. Yeah, the best way I can do it is go down to this chart. So this blue line shows what the pension plans have assumed that they would earn every year. And this is a rolling average going from 2001 until today. The yellow is what they've actually earned over that period. And you see there's no point where these averages have crossed over. So this tells us that the plan has always assumed it's going to earn more than it actually has. And which leads into why the plans are still 7.6 billion in debt, despite the state throwing in around $9 billion over the last 20 years, just in extra contributions to the plan. It's really just because they're trying to catch up to not hitting their investment returns. And if you look
And
across all the plans,
right, and just
yeah,
quick introduction to that. That also implies that their present debt is undervalued. That they're a more fair estimate of how much Alaska has in debt would be higher given if we actually matched assumptions to their historical outcomes, right?
right. Yeah, so that 7.6 billion figure I gave you, if they were more realistic with their future outlook and use a 6.5 discount rate, the the unfunded liabilities would be oh, sorry, let me go back to Alaska, would jump from 7.6 to 9.6 essentially. So, that's $2 billion in what we would
Right.
consider kind of hidden pension debt that's going to be exposed at
Our
some
un,
point.
our unfunded liability is a product of future investment earnings, and we're
That's right.
using a rate that you're making the argument is we haven't ever reached the rate that we say we're going to use
That's right.
as that
Yeah,
assumption.
that's
And
correct.
if we were using a rate of what we have actually earned over this time period, then our unfunded liability would be several billion dollars more.
Right. Or even a rate more similar with what other plans are assuming that they're going to earn. Plans that are still open, they still have assets coming in.
You're talking
Uh,
about plans in other states
yes,
that are
yes.
actively have active
That's right.
new employees.
Yep. These active plans still expect to earn less than Alaska. New York expects to earn 5.9%, and they have one of the best funded pension systems in the country. And so I really think, that 7.25 number is hiding a lot of debt that the state's going to be on the hook for, regardless of if this bill passes or not. Uh, those costs are going to go up in the near future.
But
Um,
that's seriously
And
concerning.
the longer it takes to address that and starts paying and incorporating that estimate in your balance sheets, the more expensive it becomes
yeah,
because you're basically foregoing all those investment returns you would have if you had funded your plan properly, right? By not having money in the pot. So was why we say that pension debt compounds, and it's the most expensive debt any state could ever have because it is compounding in a sense at the assumed rate of return a plan has, and that is an interest rate in a sense that is higher than any bond that Alaska could ever issue. And so that's why we say that in that sense, it's the most expensive, highest compounding that any state could have.
So you've got a pretty fancy chart here, and for those of you that are listening to the podcast, that is completely useless to you because we can't show it through the radio. But if you go to mustreadalaska.com or you go to YouTube, Must Read Alaska Show, this will be published there in the video form, and you'll be able to look and see what we're looking at here, and I'm sure that will probably make a little bit more sense when you're actually looking at the graph, which I would recommend that you do. Um, do you have some information here on what HB 78 proposes?
I do. Yeah, let me go back here. So if we just go back to the difference between, so let's put aside kind of the old debt and let's look at what HB 78 would do to the state's finances. And this is combined. So HB 78 would close the DC plan, put all public employees and teachers into a defined benefit plan. And not just that, but also everybody hired since 2005 would have the option as well to join that defined benefit plan, which increases costs quite a bit from our figures. Is we're seeing that the difference, if everything goes great, and again, this is using the plan's own assumptions, which have been inaccurate. So this is like what I would say is a very rosy picture, is the difference between these two numbers. Status quo is if nothing changes, the DC stays, House Bill 78 doesn't pass. The state would expect to pay around $19.38 billion over the next 30 years. If HB 78 was to pass, that figure would jump up to about 21.2. And so, right or just shy of $2 billion is the best case scenario of what this bill is going to cost.
Using rosy assumptions from the bill sponsor or plan sponsor.
Yeah, just
If
whatever
nothing, everyone wrong.
what the plans assume is going to happen today. Again, those assumptions have been inaccurate. Every state they've been inaccurate. And so if we model this bill more based on what market returns have actually been since 2000, and this is essentially what this stress figure is if the next 30 years matches the last 30, what'll be the costs? And so we'll see the delta here is if nothing changes, the state will have to put in about 32.4 billion. And again, that jump is just because of how much debt and liability still exists in the old defined benefit plans. That's why that number is so high. But if HB 78 were to pass, that delta goes from 32.4 to 43.2, and that's, just shy of a $9 billion increase. So when we are trying to talk to legislators, we give them the rosy, best case, you can expect to pay about $2 billion extra for this bill, which we see is not going to help anybody. It's going to hurt most employees, frankly. On the backside, the stress scenario, it's about 9 billion. Somewhere in between there is going to be the actual figure, most likely, that the state will be on the hook for. And this is just additional costs from this bill passing.
Well, there's an old adage that says you should post a plan for the worst and hope for the best. And what you're describing here for HB 78 is hoping for the best and planning for the best. Like we just think the best is going to happen to us.
Yeah.
Well,
and unfortunately, there's not quite enough changes in the funding policy from the old defined benefit plans to really make that these employer contributions flip. When we see most pension reform, it involves a little bit more cost sharing between employees and employers. This bill, it has a bit higher employee minimum rate, but it puts all the discretion for future employee rates at the discretion of a pension board it's really difficult. I'll just say it that way. It's really difficult to raise an employee's contribution rate because it's essentially just a cut to their take-home pay. And so
I can imagine that the decision to do that would be a political one in a state that's heavily influenced by public sector employees and unions.
As a share of employment, Alaska has the highest share of public sector employees in the entire country. Just as a share of all work, all jobs in Alaska, you guys have the highest sector of public employees.
Can we talk about some of the assumptions? So in the 6 years that I was in the legislature, I watched the government employee positions, not necessarily those that are hired, but the authorized positions grow significantly. And the amount of money that we put towards our pay and benefits increase significantly. We're talking $500 million. So what are the assumptions being made with HB 78 in regards to employee growth and employee pay growth? Is that something that we can look at?
Sure. So it's frankly, it's changed a couple times over the last few sessions with the bills. So the best thing that we can have is what the plan actuary, Buck, expects to happen. And so we've gotten that through their fiscal notes over the last two sessions with the two bills, last bill, Senate Bill 88. I believe their assumption on last fiscal note was or on SB 88's fiscal note was that if this bill passed, salary growth would grow at about 3% per year, and there would be some retention effect, which means more employees, which means a higher liability figure. So that's really the best probably that we can go off of today is that it, regardless of the data that we see that says this most likely isn't going to help your recruitment and retention at all, if it did, it would cause costs probably to go up even higher than what we've shown here today.
Well,
And of course, if you have you know, net defined benefit system, any future raises would also be reflected in future increases in your pension benefit. So you would also have the problem that if you want to give out future raises after you also give what was perceived as a better pension benefit, which we know in the numbers is not, you would also have to add that to the total cost of the DB, the cost of future raises impacting estimated pension payments in the future.
do you have, does your chart here show what our current DC system? So we were looking at what the future looks like with the DB system in 78. What does the DC system that we're currently at look like for status quo, I guess? Just to jump back and take a look at it. That's what we were looking at earlier here.
Yeah. So for the teachers, there's a 7% employer contribution plus an 8% employee contribution, which brings them to a 15% total, which if they were in SBS or Social Security would be, plenty from our perspective. The general and all others, plus the police and fire, they have a bit lower employer contribution. Instead of 7, it's 5. Now, some of these members are in SBS, not all of them. I think I'm not sure if we have a real good grasp of just the percentage of employees that are in it. But their defined contribution plan for the general public employee and the police and fire is lower than the teachers. And then for the police and fire, again, they're also at a 5% employer, 8% employee. One of our recommendations dating back to the first week, I think we were up in Alaska a few years ago, was to look at boosting this employer contribution rate to police and fire just because they work a shorter career. And we thought there was a small gap there that could be made up.
So let's talk about that for just a second. Back out to a higher level. We've got a push within the legislature to create a new defined benefits system that returns the state to what we used to have, but was replaced by the defined contribution system that is what all new employees currently are in. What you just highlighted was that there are some things that maybe could make the defined contribution system that we currently have more competitive or a better retirement system. And that could be a bill that the legislature considers in comparison or in juxtaposition to the 78, HB 78 or Senate Bill 78 that is creating an entirely new defined benefit system that would take us back to where we were in the past. So we don't actually have two alternatives in the legislature right now, but we could have two alternatives in the legislature: return to a defined benefit system or improve the system that we have right now. Those are kind of two broad options that we could have, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Well, just from personal experience, that's what we tried to do last session and last legislature and weren't very successful. Yeah. I think there's just a kind of a blinder turned on to fixing the defined contribution system because we are, I don't know, holding out hope or wanting to manipulate the system here in Alaska so that we get back to a defined benefit system. But
it just seems like if you're going to throw more money in towards a pension, it would make more sense to throw it into something that's actually going to benefit the membership, and not just benefit, this massive plan. And so, if we were to boost this employer contribution rate figure up, you can see here that, for most even public safety with the current rates, until you hit about year 25, which is when they can retire early under the DB, the DC is going to be better. But if we boosted that up, to 7, gave everybody SBS who's not in it, we're talking doubling the benefit in a lot of cases.
Well, and on that too, I think it's important to consider that, government pension systems are not a social program, right? They're part of employee compensation. And a lot of it, our decisions have to be informed on what will, have the best return on investment for governments, right? So with that in mind as well, it's important to consider that, if you have, resources that you want to pour into increasing the compensation of your employees, you can dedicate that towards increasing and strengthening their retirement benefits, or you could also, as I alluded in the beginning, direct that towards their salaries, which research shows again and again is their preferred method of that their employees are more responsive to salary changes in terms of recruitment, retention, and satisfaction more than retirement benefits. But also research shows that it's often the reason that public employees cite for leaving public service, that their salaries are not enough, and they would rather receive, they would rather have a better salary somewhere else. So it is also, I think, it's important to, as a tone of this for this conversation is that we're also discussing the return on investment for, taxpayer dollars, right? And what's the best way to attract talent and keep talent. And this is and often salaries can be a better option for everyone.
Yeah. And there's a lot of ways to deal with if the big, let's say the big issue with police and fires, they don't want to wait till 59 and a half, which is how long you have to wait to pull the DC. There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different retirement accounts that you can use in addition to the DC to give, let's say the police and fire member wants to retire at 53, then you could contribute, instead of increasing this DC, you could contribute a significant amount to a 457 deferred compensation plan, which has no age minimum to draw it out. And so, there's a lot of different ways to boost the benefit here that is actually a benefit increase.
We had talked earlier in this conversation. I know we're kind of reaching the end of our time today, but you had said something about an actuarial from Senate Bill 88 or the previous legislature, and the actuarial being a study, an assumption based on assumptions of what we predict the future would be for this particular financial instrument. Do we have an actuarial for 78 for Senate Bill 78? Do we know what is currently being projected, or do we have a fiscal note for it? Do we actually know what the numbers are for it, or are we still using numbers from previous bills?
So there's not been an update to the fiscal note for House Bill 78 yet. I expect it to be any week now. I think they were contracted to do it in early February. So I'd expect that actuarial to be done anytime now. All the numbers you've seen here is just from what our actuary has built for us using Alaska's membership data that we have. And so our costs, but again, our costs is basically matched up exactly to Buck's last year, who's the Pine actuary. The big difference is, and one thing that I hope that they come back with in their fiscal note this year is some more stress testing around future possibilities that aren't exactly what the plan's assuming. A lot of when you talk about a pension bill, it's really important to have the range of possibilities and not just one figure that you're going forward looking at. So for legislators, especially, I think it's really important to know, what's the worst case, what's the best case, what kind of dollars are we talking about here.
There's a conversation that I had within this last week about investment accounts, and this was more directed towards the permanent fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund. One of the things that was made is that if you've got a fund that is it has less active money going in, but its purpose is to give a benefit going out, then your goals for managing that money are different than it might be if you're putting money into it all the time. So, and the director Painter with the Legislative Finance Division was trying to explain this, and I'm going to do a very poor job of summarizing what he was saying. But the main point was, if you're looking at an investment vehicle from the retiree perspective, that someone who's retired and drawing from that investment vehicle, you have one set of goals for investment for the fund. And then if you're an employee like he is in that case, then and he's in a defined contribution system, he's going to have a different investment strategy because he's got more time to build up his investment vehicle. So the question that I've got is, when we talked previously about assumptions on investment returns, and we have not, our plan has not ever reached what we said we wanted to reach. Is that a function of just the reality of a plan that has people pulling from it, and you just have to manage it less with a little bit less risk because you know that you're going to have to pull from it? Is that part of the issue, or am I wildly off base here?
I think it's more of a function of, and this is not an Alaska specific issue. This is why almost every plan is in debt at this point, is plans kept that future assumption on investment earnings high because it made it cheaper for employees and employers. It made the pension cheaper. It meant they had to put less money in because they expected it to earn more on the market. When that started changing in the early mid 2000s, and those future expectations started to lower for basically, all the private sector started lowering it. The public sector left it high. They did not want to change it. They thought they would be able to invest their way out of all these issues. And so they left that number high. The problem in Alaska and a lot of other places is once they hit reality and that wasn't going to happen anymore, it became very expensive to drop that assumption down, because every time you drop it, the present value of liabilities skyrockets up, which means the gap between your assets and liabilities, also known as pension debt, increases. And so if plans were more nimble and took the hit to that future assumption earlier, we would not be having the same conversation we're having right now. But most plans thought that they would be able to invest their way out. They could leave the assumption high. They would just change their asset pool, take on riskier investments. I can even show you a quick chart about that. But this is a very common thread here. But if you take anything away from this chart, blue and green are safe assets, orange and yellow are more risky assets. You can see all these plans going, oh crap, we're not going to be able to hit our future return figure with our current asset allocation. So what do we have to do? We have to take on more risk. And they keep adding in more and more risk. And even despite all this, they still weren't able to hit that return figure. And so now those rates are starting to come down, even with the portfolios staying pretty risky. And so I think that's more why we're at where we are today, and why leaving that rate at where it is today for a new plan is so frustrating.
That's, I guess, for the listeners that are listening to this podcast, if you've made it this far, you really need to go to the YouTube channel and look at this chart. This probably helps us explain what's happening with the asset allocation decisions at the permanent fund itself. And I don't want to put words into other people's mouths right now, but we've had a decision made here in the last couple of years to increase private equity allocations within the permanent fund, which is keeping with what you're showing here. An increased private equity is increased risk. It is also increased time for return on investment, but it potentially could have a higher return on investment. But that's in my mind, I'm seeing a similarity with a management strategy that says, hey, we're having a hard time achieving what we said we were going to achieve a while ago, and therefore we're going to need to do something a little higher risk to keep up with what we said we needed to, or our perceived obligation or financial obligation is.
Exactly right.
That's right. And you also can see in this chart that, a big chunk of that was from reductions in fixed income. So that's like, plans that have, bonds, either federal bonds or, municipal bonds, corporate bonds. And a big reason why, many asset allocators have decreased their fixed income allocations, because interest rates were very low for a long time. We had periods of negative real interest rates on, federal interest rates. And many asset allocators had to get creative. They had to find yield elsewhere, and a lot of that volatility and shift towards risk taking is national. And we have seen many allocators, again, in pensions, asset managers shift towards private equity and hedge funds in search of yield. So as Ryan said, this is not unique to Alaska, but it is important to note that what we see with pensions is that even though they have increased their risk taking, we don't see that reflecting in returns very well. We actually find that 99% of pension funds in our report have underperformed the S&P 500 over the past 20 years. And they have done that while paying a lot more money to invest than they would have in the S&P, right? They pay, those private managers charge very high fees. And also these funds, these private funds are very expensive. No, not very expensive, but they're also very risky, right? So what we find is that most pensions are taking on more risk than public markets, the S&P 500 or just bond markets. And you can create what we have here, a 60-40 portfolio, that's 60%, stocks and 40% bonds. And, even then we find many pensions underperforming that while taking on more risk and paying more money, more investment fees. So again, this is a national trend, but it is just something to note that this increased trend towards seeking returns, gambling for redemption is what some have called, has not really panned out in many ways.
Wow. Well, I suspect that we could probably add another hour of this conversation and discuss the details that you've got here. Would you be willing to come back on the show and have a conversation when we have actuarial or cost analysis on HB7 or SB 78 here in a few weeks, if and when it shows up?
Be happy to. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you, Ryan and Mariana, for your time and coming on the show today. It's been very enlightening. I thought that I knew quite a bit about pensions in Alaska, and I have learned some new things today. So I appreciate you spending the time with us. We covered a lot of ground on the topic of pensions today. If you have questions, email me at bcarpenter@mustreadalaska.com. And we'll see if we can't get you answers and address it on a future episode. If you're listening to the show and this is something that you find of value and want to continue, then I would ask you to consider going to the mustreadalaska.com and clicking on the donate link, helping us keep the lights on and help us bring on guests like this that further shine the light on the decisions that our legislators and decision makers of the state and to some extent federal level are making on our behalf. We consistently have to pledge our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor to maintain our freedom in this nation. And that is a choice that we make. So this is Ben Carpenter for the Must Read Alaska Show. Thanks for joining us. Stay frosty out there.